"You're not family," went, "You're just a wallet with legs." The words didn't come from a stranger. They came from the woman who married my only son, spoken with a smile that cut deeper than a knife. She stood in my own living room, sipping coffee from the mug I had bought her, while my son stared at the floor, silent and complicit. My chest tightened. I had dialed that morning with nothing but joy. I wanted to know the date of their wedding so I could mark it on my calendar, buy flowers, and wear the pale dress I had carefully chosen weeks ago. Instead, my daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eye and said with casual cruelty, "We already got married yesterday." Only special people were invited, special people. The phrase hung in the air like smoke, choking me. I had paid their rent for 3 years, covered groceries when their fridge was empty, and given them money for clothes, bills, even her engagement ring. Yet when it came to the most important day of my son's life, I wasn't considered special. I stood there frozen, holding the phone in my hand as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. My mind raced through images, the closet where my dress and new shoes now sat useless, the envelope of cash I had set aside as a wedding gift, the spotless dining table I had polished in anticipation of a celebration that would never come. In one cruel instant, it all collapsed. Later that evening, I scrolled through social media with trembling hands. There they were. My son and his bride, radiant in white, raising champagne glasses. Her parents beamed proudly at their side. Her siblings clinked glasses. Her cousins laughed. And me? I was nowhere, just a ghost, invisible on the happiest day of my son's life. The betrayal burned. For years, I had walked on eggshells, afraid to say no, afraid to upset them, afraid of losing what little affection I thought I had. I mistook financial sacrifice for love, convincing myself that if I gave enough, they would see me, value me, want me close. But the truth was now undeniable. To them, I was nothing more than an ATM with feelings. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and cried. Not tears of sadness, but tears of humiliation, hot, bitter, cleansing. I cried for the years I had wasted, for the woman I had become, for the love I thought could be bought. I cried because deep down, I knew this wasn't just about one wedding. It was about years of being used, dismissed, and treated like my worth began and ended with the money in my bank account. And yet, as I wiped my face and looked into the mirror, something stirred. Behind the tired eyes and wrinkles of sacrifice, a new hardness emerged. I didn't know it then, but that cruel phrase, "only special people," would awaken a strength in me I had long forgotten. A week after that humiliating revelation, my phone rang. Her voice was no longer smug, but trembling. "Renata, the rent's overdue. The landlord says he'll evict us if we don't pay this week. You must have forgotten to transfer the money." Forgotten? My lips curled bitterly. For 3 years, I had canceled vacations, skipped meals, and lived like a pauper so they could have comfort. Forgotten was the last thing I ever did. I let the silence stretch, savoring her panic. Then, with a calm I barely recognized in myself, I said, "Didn't I tell you? I only help special people." The line went quiet, so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. For the first time in years, it wasn't me trembling. It was her. But that was just the beginning. Days later, I returned home to find 3 cars parked in front of my house. My son, his wife, and a stranger in a gray suit were waiting inside. They were rifling through papers on my dining table, my private documents. "What is happening here?" I demanded. Lena's voice was syrupy, dripping with false concern. "Renata, thank God you're here. This is Mr. Fisher, a family lawyer. We're worried about you." My son finally raised his head, his eyes hollow with calculation. "Mom, your behavior has been strange. Cutting off support, ignoring our calls. Maybe you're not well. We think you might need guardianship. It's for your protection guardianship." The word landed like a slap. They weren't just asking for money. They wanted control, legal, permanent control. I almost laughed. Strange behavior? You mean deciding my money belongs to me, choosing not to finance 2 adults who excluded me from their wedding? Lena's mask cracked. Her eyes flashed cold steel. "Everything you have will belong to us one day anyway. We're just speeding up the process." There it was, The naked truth. To them, I wasn't a mother. I was an inheritance on legs. Get out, I said, pointing to the door. Mr. Fisher slid a folder toward me. Power of attorney papers, neat and tidy, ready for my signature. Without even looking, I tossed them into the trash. The only transition happening here is yours, out of my house. Their faces hardened. For the first time, they realized their golden goose could fight back, but the betrayal was deeper than I imagined. The next morning, a social worker knocked on my door with a clipboard. She said she had received a report that I was paranoid, confused, and neglecting my own health. Every word was crafted to make me sound like a senile old woman. Lena's fingerprints were all over it. This wasn't just emotional manipulation anymore. It was character assassination, a campaign to strip me of my dignity in the eyes of the state. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had counted bills for their rent, and I made a decision. I called my lawyer, Mr. Weber, a man who had handled my late husband's will. He listened carefully, then said, "What your son and daughter-in-law are attempting is elder financial abuse. It's a crime, Renata, but they've made a mistake. They underestimated you." His words lit a fire in me. For years, I had confused silence with peace. I thought compliance meant love. But now I saw clearly. I wasn't protecting them. I was enabling them. And they were ready to bury me alive just to keep the money flowing. So I chose a different path. I canceled every transfer, changed the locks on my house, installed cameras, and opened a new account they would never touch. For the first time, my money was mine. And yet, deep inside, the pain lingered, the pain of a double betrayal. My son, the boy I raised alone, and the woman I welcomed like a daughter, had both conspired against me. Blood and marriage, united not by love, but by greed. I looked in the mirror that night, not at a broken woman, but at a warrior reborn. They had called me weak, confused, irrelevant. They thought they could erase me with lies and paperwork. But they had forgotten one thing. I had survived worse storms, and this time I would fight not for them, but for myself. That night, after I had thrown their lawyer's folder into the trash and changed the locks on my doors, I thought I had drawn the line. I believed the worst was over, but betrayal has a way of digging deeper, like a vine that tightens the more you fight it. For a few days, the phone stayed quiet. I walked through the park, drank coffee at my kitchen table, and for the first time in years, I felt my money and my mornings belonged only to me. Yet in the back of my mind, I knew silence was only a pause, not peace. The knock came on a Thursday morning. A neatly dressed young woman stood on my porch, holding a clipboard and flashing an official badge. "Good morning, Mrs. Richter," she said. "I'm a social investigator from Senior Services. We've received reports that you may be at risk. We need to conduct a wellness check." Her tone was polite, but the words cut me to the bone. I had heard this tactic before, whispered in Lena's threats. They wanted me declared incompetent. Inside, she began reading from her file. "Reports suggest you've shown erratic financial behavior, installed unnecessary security systems due to paranoia, and cut off communication with your family." I didn't need to guess who wrote those reports. Every line dripped with Lena's rehearsed vocabulary. Confused, paranoid, isolated. It was all part of their script. I forced myself to stay calm. "Miss, I will not answer questions without my lawyer present." 20 minutes later, Mr. Weber arrived, sharp-eyed and steady. He checked the investigator's ID, then laid out folders of documentation, bank statements, medical records, proof of my independence. "My client is in perfect health," he said firmly. "If anyone needs investigation here, it's the relatives who drained $33,000 from her account in 3 years." The social worker shifted uncomfortably. By the time she left, her confidence had evaporated. But I wasn't relieved. I was shaken, not by her questions, but by the realization of how far my own son was willing to go. He wasn't just cutting me out of his wedding or sneaking into my house. He was trying to erase my voice, my mind, my autonomy. And then came the second betrayal, colder, sharper than the first. 3 weeks later, Mr. Weber walked into my living room with a grim expression. He carried a stack of papers that seemed to weigh down his hands. Renata, he said, they've filed a formal petition in family court. Your son and daughter-in-law are suing to have you declared mentally incompetent. They're asking for guardianship over your finances. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My knees buckled as I sank into the chair. My own child, the boy I raised through nights of fevers and fears, was now trying to legally strip me of my freedom. What evidence could they possibly have? I whispered. Weber flipped through the file. Statements from your daughter-in-law, a neighbor, and even your pharmacist. They claim you've been hoarding medication, refusing treatment, acting paranoid. They've twisted every act of self-preservation into proof of decline. I felt my stomach turn. Mr. Davis, the bitter man across the street, had probably complained about my new cameras. And my pharmacist? He must have signed something without realizing its purpose, lies stacked on lies, but dressed up in the language of concern. This was no longer a family argument. It was war. That night, I sat alone in the glow of my kitchen light, staring at the documents that questioned my sanity. I thought of the little boy who once hugged me tight and said I was the best mom in the world. Where had he gone? Or had he always been this man, and I had blinded myself with love? I closed the folder and took a deep breath. Tears slid down my face, but they weren't just tears of grief. They were fuel. If they wanted to drag me into court, then court would be the battlefield where I reclaimed my dignity. In the weeks that followed, I met with Dr. Moore, a psychiatrist Mr. Weber trusted. She tested my memory, reasoning, and finances. Her verdict was clear. Mrs. Richter, you are sharper than many 40-year-olds I know. I gathered allies, my neighbor Eleanor, my stylist Cynthia, even the hardware store owner who had watched me buy locks for protection. Each one offered to testify, not out of obligation, but out of genuine concern. For the first time, I felt surrounded by a family of choice, not of blood. The day of the hearing arrived. I dressed in my best black suit and stood before the mirror, steadier than I had ever been. They can try to erase me, I whispered, but today I will be heard. And as I walked into that courtroom, facing my son in a polished suit and Lena in black as if attending a funeral, I realized she was right. It was a funeral, but not mine. It was the funeral of their illusion of control. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and tension. My heels clicked against the marble floor as I followed Mr. Weber down the long hallway. Every step echoed louder than my heartbeat. Ahead of me, my son stood with Lena at his side. He wore a brand new suit, dark and pressed, the kind of outfit he could never afford without my money. Lena dressed in black as though she were attending a funeral. In a way, she was the funeral of whatever remained of our family bond. When our eyes met, Max looked away, but Lena didn't flinch. Her stare was sharp, cold, triumphant, as if she already saw herself holding the keys to my accounts. We entered the courtroom. The judge, a man with steady eyes and a calm presence, took his seat. This court will hear the matter of guardianship petitioned by Max and Lena Richter, he said. My name, my life, now reduced to a case file. Their lawyer spoke first, his voice solemn, rehearsed. Your Honor, our client's mother has demonstrated alarming behavior. She has isolated herself from family, squandered finances irrationally, and shown signs of paranoia. Out of love, my clients seek guardianship to ensure her safety and well-being. The words were carefully chosen, twisting my independence into instability. My refusal to be exploited now framed as mental decline. Then came the witnesses. Lena took the stand first. Tears flowed on command. Renata has always been like a second mother to me, she said, her voice trembling. But lately, she's changed. She won't answer our calls. She lashes out. She even accused us of stealing. We're terrified for her safety. She dabbed at her eyes, a perfect actress in a courtroom theater. When Mr. Weber cross-examined her, the cracks showed. Mrs. Richter, he began, when was the last time you called my client without asking for money? She hesitated. Well, we always talked about many things. A date, please. I can't recall. Is it true you and your husband married without inviting her? It was a small ceremony. And when she asked about it, you told her only special people were invited. What context could possibly make those words less cruel? Her face flushed crimson. For the first time, her performance faltered. Then Max stepped up. Seeing him raise his hand to swear an oath nearly broke me. My little boy, well, the one I had rocked to sleep after nightmares, was now swearing to lie about my mind. He spoke with practiced sincerity. My mother has always been generous, but lately she's been erratic, refusing to support us, cutting us off suddenly. We think she's being manipulated by outsiders. Weber's question sliced through the performance. How much money have you received from your mother in the last 3 years? I don't know the exact amount. Would $33,400 sound about right? Max shifted uncomfortably. Maybe. She's always been generous. And how many times have you visited her without asking for money? The silence was deafening. One by one, their so-called witnesses followed. Mr. Davis, the neighbor, complained about my cameras and strange visitors, but under questioning, he admitted he'd never spoken to me directly. My pharmacist, Mr. Green, confessed he had been tricked into signing a vague statement by Lena. Their house of cards wobbled, then it was our turn. Mr. Green testified again, this time explaining the manipulation. Dr. Moore presented her cognitive evaluation. Mrs. Richter's mental acuity is excellent, well above average for her age. Eleanor, my neighbor, spoke gently but firmly about my independence, how she had seen me build friendships and protect myself. Even the hardware store owner testified. She came to me clear-minded, asking for locks and cameras. That's not paranoia, that's prudence. Finally, Mr. Weber called me to the stand. My hands trembled as I placed them on the Bible, but when I began to speak, the tremor faded. I told my story, from the rent payments to the secret wedding, from the humiliation of being excluded to the moment I realized I was nothing but an ATM with legs. I recounted the folder of papers they tried to shove across my table, the threats disguised as concern, the endless withdrawals from my savings. "Why did you stop supporting your son and daughter-in-law?" Weber asked. "Because I finally understood," I said, my voice steady, clear, that what I was receiving wasn't love. It was a transaction. My money was welcome, but I was not. Love that must be bought isn't love at all. Their lawyer tried to shake me. He implied I was confused, manipulated by neighbors. But each question he asked only gave me room to answer with more precision, more clarity. I wasn't the trembling woman they had painted. I was sharper than I had been in years. When the testimonies ended, both sides gave their closing arguments. Their lawyer insisted I was a vulnerable woman led astray. Mr. Weber's rebuttal was simple but devastating. "Your Honor, what we've seen is not confusion. It is clarity. A woman exploited for years has chosen to protect herself. That is not incompetence, that is strength." The judge leaned back, his fingers steepled, his face unreadable. "The court will recess for deliberation," he said. As the gavel struck, the room emptied into murmurs. Max avoided my eyes. Lena glared at me with pure venom, as if my refusal to surrender was a personal insult. But I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, breathing slowly. For years, I had been silenced, dismissed, used. But now my truth was on the record. The outcome was uncertain, but one thing was not. I would never again mistake sacrifice for love. The courtroom doors creaked open after what felt like an eternity. 2 hours of waiting had stretched like 2 years. I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, refusing to let my son or his wife see the fear clawing at my chest. When Judge Miller re-entered, the room fell into a hush. Even Lena's crocodile tears dried in anticipation. After reviewing all evidence, the judge began, his voice steady and deliberate, "This court finds no grounds to declare Mrs. Renata Richter mentally incompetent." The words washed over me like sunlight after years of winter. He continued, his gaze firm. "Professional evaluations confirm she is of sound mind. Her financial decisions, while painful to her family, are rational, legal, and within her rights. Furthermore, the evidence suggests this petition was motivated by financial interest rather than genuine concern. The request for guardianship is hereby denied in full." The gavel struck. The sound was final, sharp, liberating. I exhaled, a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. For the first time in months, I felt air fill my lungs without heaviness. Across the aisle, Lena's face twisted, fury replacing her rehearsed sorrow. Max slumped in his chair, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume borrowed for a play he had failed to perform. Their lawyer shuffled his papers quickly, already retreating from a case he knew was lost. When I stood, my knees did not tremble. I walked out of that courtroom taller than when I had entered. Outside, the sunlight felt warmer than I remembered. Mr. Weber placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You didn't just win your freedom today," he said softly. "You proved something that needed to be said. That dignity has no price tag." I nodded, though tears blurred my vision. They weren't tears of sorrow, they were tears of release, of reclamation. As I stepped onto the courthouse steps, Max approached. His eyes darted nervously, searching for words. "Mom," he muttered, "this is going to end badly for you. One day, you'll need us. You'll be alone." I looked at him, really looked at him, not as the boy I once held, but as the man who had stood in court and tried to erase me. My voice was steady. "I'm already alone, Max. The difference is, now it's by choice, not by your neglect." His face darkened, but I turned away. There was nothing more to say. That night, my house was filled not with silence, but with laughter. Eleanor brought over a bottle of wine. Cynthia from the salon joined us, along with Alfreda and Maria from the garden club, women who had walked their own roads of betrayal and survival. We toasted not just to my legal victory, but to freedom itself. "Renata," Alfreda said, her 80 years of wisdom shining in her eyes, "today you didn't just win a case, you buried an illusion. That's harder, but it's worth far more." Her words cut straight to my heart. She was right. What I grieved wasn't just the money or the years wasted. It was the dream that my son loved me unconditionally. That dream was gone now, but in its place, something stronger had been born: clarity. Over the following weeks, I rebuilt. I changed the locks again, this time not out of fear, but out of choice. I opened a new bank account at a bank they had never touched. I bought myself flowers, bright lilies and roses, and set them on my dining table. For the first time in years, that table bore something beautiful, not bills or threats. I visited Robert's grave, my late husband. Kneeling by his stone, I whispered, "I finally opened my eyes. The money you left me, I nearly wasted trying to buy love, but no more. I'll use it the way you wanted, for my peace, for my life." The wind stirred gently through the trees, and for a moment I swore I felt his approval. I began to travel. Paris in the spring, Rome in the fall. I enrolled in an art class, painting the flowers I had once only bought for others. At the salon, Cynthia laughed and said, "You look 10 years younger, Renata. Free looks good on you." And she was right. Occasionally, I'd hear rumors. Max and Lena downsized to a smaller apartment. He picked up extra shifts. She found a job for the first time in years. Perhaps adversity was teaching them what my generosity never could, the value of honest work. But I no longer lingered on their choices. My life was finally my own. One evening, sitting on my new apartment balcony overlooking the city lights, I lifted a glass of wine to the night sky. The stars gleamed above, steady and bright. I thought of the woman I used to be, the one trembling, hoping money could buy affection. She was gone. In her place stood someone reborn, someone who finally understood a truth too long ignored. Real love never comes with a receipt, and freedom is never too expensive. And as the city hummed below, I whispered into the night, "I am free. And this time, it's forever." The night on my balcony felt like a quiet victory. The city lights flickered below me. The glass of wine was smooth on my tongue. And for the first time in decades, I belonged entirely to myself. Freedom was no longer a dream. It was here, alive in every breath I took. But freedom, I realized, wasn't just about money. It wasn't about the court ruling or the locks on my door. It was about reclaiming my voice, my dignity, my right to be seen as more than a bank account. For years, I had mistaken sacrifice for love. I thought that by giving endlessly, I could fill the emptiness of neglect. But all I did was teach others how easy it was to use me. the harsh truth is this: if you have to buy affection, it isn't love. And if you have to bleed yourself dry to be valued, then you were never valued at all. What I learned painfully but powerfully is that boundaries are not cruelty. Boundaries are love, love for yourself, the kind that keeps you standing when everyone else wants to knock you down. Some nights, I still think of Max. I wonder if the boy who once clung to me in the dark is still buried somewhere inside the man who betrayed me. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't, but that is no longer my burden to carry. His choices are his. Mine are finally mine. I've started living again. I paint, I travel, I laugh with friends who know me, not for what I can give, but for who I am. I walk into a cafe and order dessert without calculating how many dollars I should save for someone else's rent. These small joys are my revolution. And to anyone listening, anyone who has ever felt invisible in their own family, hear me when I say this: your worth is not measured by what you provide. You do not have to buy a seat at a table where you were never invited. Build your own table. Set it with flowers, laughter, and respect. That is where love will find you. The greatest lesson I carry is simple but unshakable. True love has no receipt, and freedom is never too expensive. So now I want to ask you, what would you do in my place? Would you keep paying for love, or would you choose finally to live free? Tell me in the comments. I read them all, and your stories matter. If you've ever faced a betrayal like mine or found the courage to reclaim your life, I want to hear it. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, cry, or even smile, then please like this video, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe to the channel, because there are many more family stories waiting for you here. Stories that expose betrayal, celebrate resilience, and remind us that dignity is worth fighting for. Every click, every comment, every share helps keep these voices alive. Not just mine, but all of ours. Because when we tell the truth, when we stand up for ourselves, we give courage to others to do the same. So with a heart both scarred and stronger, I leave you with this: protect your dignity, cherish your freedom, and never forget that the most important person you have to love in this life is yourself. And as you do, remember, you are not alone. We are building a table here together, one story at a time.